Well, welcome to you all for what is the 10th and final webinar in this series, Digging Deeper in Lockdown. So a number of you have been with me for most, if not all, of this whole stage. We've been around the Holy Land, we've been with Paul around the Mediterranean, we've explored Oxford with C.S. Lewis and John Wesley, and a pigeon on top of the spire of St. Mary's. And for the 5th in the series, we went round the Ashmolean Museum with the Bible, and tonight, the 10th and the last in the series, we're going to be going around the British Museum with the Bible. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. As ever, some of you will be able to repeat this now. 3 purposes when I do the museum tours, either in person or virtually like this. So the first purpose is to help confirm the truth and historicity of the Bible. The second purpose is to help the Bible come to life as we read it. And third thing is to provide some good material and equip teachers and preachers. And I hope that's all going to be true tonight, but there will be a slight difference. So in the previous sessions, we've generally looked at 10 smaller items together. Today I'm going to split it into 2. The first part, we'll do a little group of a meze of sort of 5 items or slides, and then in the second half we're going to step back a little bit and reflect more widely on perhaps the message of the British Museum. So without any further ado, we're going to take you here to the British Museum. Here we are. So there was some display going on there outside, but welcome to all of you to the British Museum. So opened in 1759, relatively modern museum. Ashmolean, of course, in Oxford, as you will know from webinar 5, was opened 70 years earlier or so. What was the world like in 1759? Well, it was still round, the sun shone, perhaps not quite as hot as today, but John Wesley was preaching. There were a handful of states that made up the Union, and archaeology was in its infancy. If you want to come to the British Museum, there are many ways of visiting. You can go on a self-guided tour with a book. You can book in with a tour guide. It's probably more of a reference work than something that you read cover to cover. So best to dip in from time to time and look at different sections. The study of archaeology has been called the study of durable rubbish. And so really what you're looking at is what's left over, been left behind by previous generations. Tonight, as I said, we're not going to do everything that I would do in a museum tour. We're just going to look at a very small number of items, and they're going to be linked together, I think, by Babylon. So Babylon is the, some of you will know, is sort of like the bogeyman in the Bible. Babylon, all things bad come from there: sin, adultery, and in the book of Revelation, Babylon features badly. But why? What part did Babylon play in the history of the Jews? Well, it's a good question, and a lot of it has to do with where the Jewish people began. The father of the 3 great monotheistic faiths of the world was Abraham, known as the father of faith, and he came from a place called Ur of the Chaldees, and the Chaldean area is another word for the Babylonian area, in what's now southern Iraq. So that was Abraham's homeland. That's where the story started. That's where Abraham had his call to go, and the promise from God, threefold promise, was that even though he was an old man and childless, that he would have offspring. In fact, they would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Secondly, he would have a land, and thirdly, through his offspring, the whole world would be blessed. Now, this is the Christian story. And Christians believe that offspring through whom the whole of the world is blessed was none other than Jesus. And there are genealogies that trace his ancestry. But what was this place like that Abraham came from? What was Ur like? Well, it was excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley, and he found that a fifth of the houses had writing in. Now, this is 2000 BC. Now, you've got to remember what we were doing in these islands in the UK in 2000 BC. I think we were fairly primitive compared to this, but in Ur, they had two-story dwellings. There was music, there was science, there was augury going on, predicting the future from animal parts, and they were playing games. And one of the games that they played has turned up in quite a few of the graves, including a royal grave from Ur. And this is from several centuries before Abraham, and this is known as the Royal Game of Ur. And there's a gallery upstairs in the British Museum where we normally start with Abraham. And here we are. Here is the Royal Game of Ur. And this game was so popular, it was still being played more than 1,000 years later. Drawings have been found sketching out this diagram on other, monumental sculptures where guards or others, but like playing noughts and crosses or hopscotch, the same pattern would be marked out. The reason I'm showing you this is to remind you that Abraham is a three-dimensional person. He's a man more like us than you would think, and he'd be playing with his sons, with Ishmael, with when he was old enough, with Isaac. He'd be playing, and then one day this person who's like us was called to go. So this is the beginnings really of the people of Israel from southern Iraq, from Ur, and Abraham comes to the promised land. Then there's a period in Egypt, not just a period, 430 years. Then there's the Exodus. Then they're in the promised land, and for 800 years there is a kingdom of Israel in what we now know as the Holy Land. And towards the end of their time there were repeated warnings that if they didn't return to the covenant, follow the covenant that the Jews had been given at Mount Sinai, that they would be expelled from the land, contrary to this great promise given to Abraham. The Old Testament recalls they didn't heed this, and the warnings came, and the final destruction of the south was visited upon them by the army of the king of Babylon. And there's an extraordinary letter which has the smoke of battle on it, if you will, a letter that was sent from to the city of Lachish. If you were with us for the Assyrian talk, you'll know a bit more about Lachish. But here we are. These are known as the Lachish letters. And essentially this potsherd, you can see this bit of pottery, was an urgent message sent by a town near Lachish to the city of Lachish, saying, please come and help us because the Babylonians are coming. And they were sweeping through, taking over cities, and then Jerusalem, which is going to be destroyed, and people taken away into exile in Babylon. Now, what's this all about? What does this actually say? Well, first of all, this writing is the writing of Jeremiah. It's the writing of the prophets, and you're looking at something that's contemporaneous to Isaiah and Jeremiah. In fact, what this says on it is, we can no longer see the beacons of Azekah, so please come and help us. And this pinpoints a particular point in the march of the Babylonians. Jeremiah 34 verse 6 and 7 says that Jeremiah spoke these words, the words he'd just spoken earlier in chapter 34. He spoke these words to Zedekiah, king of Judah, in Jerusalem, when the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem, and only Lachish and Azekah remained of all the fortified cities of Judah. So what does this mean? Well, we've got a situation where Jeremiah is speaking to the king. There are two cities left. Moments later, not a few miles away, there is a town that's looking and sees Azekah fall. The beacon cuts out the beacon, I guess, like during the Spanish Armada, and if you watch Lord of the Rings, those ways of sending messages by fires being seen from one place to the next, that had gone. So literally, we've got that potsherd you just saw is right from that moment when those cities are falling. And Jeremiah, who is of course a real person, is speaking to Zedekiah, a real person, about the advance of the army of the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar and his commander Nebuzaradan. These are again all real people. So when you see a potsherd like this, it reminds you that these are real historical characters that the Bible is talking about. Now, they were taken away into exile. Daniel, there were several waves of being taken away. Daniel was in one of those waves, quite likely castrated on his way into the service of the king of Babylon, along with some of the other creme de la creme of the noble families of Jerusalem. And quite early on in his time in Babylon, Daniel is asked to come in, well, he offers to come in and to interpret the king's dream. And if you remember, it's a famous dream that Nebuchadnezzar has involving a statue with a head of gold and then parts of the body with silver, bronze, and then legs of clay and iron. Daniel interprets the dream, and this is what he says at the end. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven, so in the days of those kings, that's the iron and clay part, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. So, great prediction of a coming kingdom. Later on in his career, he's brought in when there's a certain dinner party being hosted by Belshazzar, which goes horribly wrong when a hand appears and starts writing on the wall. Daniel is called in, known for being able to interpret these mysteries, and says that this is a message from God, and basically the Babylonian Empire is about to come to an end at the hands of their great rivals, the Persians. And that's what happens. That night, according to the book of Daniel, Belshazzar is killed and the Persians come. I think, well, that's the end of that. Well, there are two problems with that. The first is that the Persian records say that they took the last king of Babylon captive, whereas the book of Daniel says that he was killed. But they can't both be true. And secondly, there's no reference to this person, Belshazzar, in any records that could be found. In fact, there's one German commentary in 1850 that said categorically that the book of Daniel, the character Belshazzar, is a completely mythical character. It's like inventing another president of the United States. There's just no record of him. He doesn't fit in. Just 4 years after that, however, a small cylinder was found. And it had been put under a temple, and it was a prayer. And I've got a picture of it here. I've also got a picture of Belshazzar's feast. Rembrandt, I was lucky enough, I popped in to see his exhibition yesterday in the Ashmolean Museum. Great picture of the weeping of Jeremiah. And not in that exhibition, but also by Rembrandt, is this wonderful picture of Belshazzar's feast and the writing on the wall, a famous picture. But on the left, you can see what's known as the cylinder of Nabonidus. Now, who was Nabonidus? He was the last king of Babylon, but in that he was a mystic, and in that little cylinder it records a prayer for his son, whose name was Belshazzar. Suddenly, for the first time in 1854, there is a record of the name Belshazzar. And that also explains that verse at the end of Daniel 5, which says that he was appointed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Well, why only the third? Well, because Belshazzar himself was only number 2 and Nabonidus number 1. So time and again, when there seems to be a contradiction between the Bible and any other evidence, just wait and it becomes clear that there is an explanation, and there's no reason to doubt what the Bible's been saying. Now the Persians come. Now just think what's happened now, by the way. The promise to Abraham, if you remember, was to give them an offspring and a land. Well, what's happened now? Here's Daniel, and they're back in southern Iraq. They're back in Babylon, the land of Abraham. So this is a bit like snakes and ladders, and you all the way back, and you're back at square one. What's happened to the what's happened to the promise to Abraham? How are the people going to get back to the land? Well, extraordinarily, this happens, and not through anything that the people of Israel engineer. Instead, the Persian king Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great, according to the scriptures, issues an edict saying that the Jews should return home and rebuild the temple. Now, that appears in the Bible. It's in the last verse of 2 Chronicles, the first verse of Ezra. And you think, why on earth? I mean, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, I mean, why on earth some extraordinarily favourable edict for the benefit of the Jews? That's just, that's fanciful. Why on earth would an emperor say that about a captive people? Go back, rebuild your temple. It seemed fanciful until the Cyrus cylinder was discovered. This is also in the British Museum, and that's the cylinder on the top right. And this is so it's a Persian, Iranian nowadays, cylinder. And what does it say? Well, among many other things, he lists his achievements and his kingship, Cyrus, and then he, in this, he orders that it pleases him to send some of his peoples back to worship their gods and rebuild their temples, and orders that financial help be given from his coffers, from the treasury Persian coffers. Now, there's no reference here to the Jews, so this isn't the same edict as is mentioned at the end of 2 Chronicles or Ezra. But suddenly, this policy, it suddenly becomes believable. That's the Cyrus cylinder, and it very closely matches those verses in 2 Chronicles and Ezra. It's extraordinary. Now, and once that happens, of course, it's game on again for the fulfillment of these prophecies and the fulfillment of the prophecy given by Daniel. We're now past the head of gold. We're now into the next kingdom down. 1 kingdom down, 3 to go before this kingdom comes in the future. Now, there were going to be other challenges, though. There was a threat during the period of a later Persian king to exterminate the Jews, effectively genocide. And that was stopped. That story is in the book of Esther. And that was during the reign Esther. And Esther lived in a palace that had been decorated by her father-in-law, Darius the Great, or Darius the First. And the other picture I've got for you there is actually some of the decoration in the palace. And this isn't just a replica. These are the actual coloured tiles from the palace at Susa, which was the home of Esther. And a few decades later was going to be the palace where Nehemiah worked. So you could be looking there at some tiles which Esther herself walked past. So I'm back again. There we are. The Jews come back. Now, we've not entirely finished at the museum yet. I've got a couple more things to show you in part 2, including a very humble little building in a remote corner of the Persian Empire. But before we go on to part 2, can we just step back a minute? We've been looking at various things from archaeology, from museums, going to the Holy Land, traveling around. With what purpose? Not just because it's interesting or to titivate, but because if these things are true, then it has great relevance and it makes a difference in our lives. So these aren't just interesting things that we're looking at. They're big questions. Is the Bible reliable? Can we trust the things it says? And I was reflecting and preparing for this and thinking and wondering whether we could actually slightly change the title of this talk in this way. How about comparing the message of the Bible and the message of the British Museum? So keep with that thought in mind. I want to show you something else here. Some sculptures from the mausoleum of Halicarnassus. Now you might think, who on earth was Halicarnassus? And why did he need a mausoleum? Well, if you ask him that question, you're a bit like me the first time I heard of this. In fact, you've got it all the way wrong, all the wrong way around. Halicarnassus is a place. Mausolus is the person who's buried. And this was such a famous structure that he gave us a new word in the world's vocabulary, the mausoleum. And this was a tomb built 350 BC in a place which is now modern day Bodrum. And look at these beautiful sculptures, wonderful horse, and then a gentleman on the right. Now, how big are these? I've got a person there next to the horse so you can see, but just hold your breath a minute. I told you about this small building in the corner of the Persian Empire. Just look at the size of this. Isn't that extraordinary? So this is the tomb of this chap, Mausolus. And if you're wondering about the size of things, what about those, do you remember that horse we just saw? So where's the horse? Here we are. The horse is up there at the very top. The size is huge, isn't it? How about this chap here and his escort? Well, they're somewhere around here. I mean, this thing was absolutely huge, 140 foot high. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And of the ones that have been destroyed, this was the last one. I think it was in the 12th or 13th century. This came down. And now it's just ruins, just stones. You know, this is extraordinary. And we see, this is like, it's almost like the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy, empire by empire falling and being replaced by another. And this reminds me of a hymn, which has these lines in it. When you think about the greatness of these huge buildings from the past, which have gone, pride of man and earthly glory, tower and temple fall to dust, but God's power, hour by hour, is my temple and my tower. Pride of man and earthly glory, tower and temple fall to dust. But isn't that the message of the museums? Is there anything that in there that was not once in its heyday seen as being ultimate? Think about nowadays, the dollar, the English royal family, empires, the names of certain big companies, Cable and Wireless. Who are they? Well, they were big at one time. So we get on and on with the empires of the world, and we can see that in our next item, which is the Rosetta Stone. This is possibly the most famous object in the museum. Here we are, and this was the key to the hieroglyphs. This is the last object we're going to look at tonight from the museum. There were 3 scripts or languages side by side, and that allowed, for the first time, people who could read the other scripts to understand what was in the Egyptian picture language, the hieroglyphs. Now, the question is simply this: who does this belong to? It's in the British Museum now. Well, you might say, well, where's Rosetta? It's a good place to start. Well, Rosetta is a place in Egypt. Right, but at the time, 196 BC, they were part of the Greek Empire. So is this a Greek object? Well, after the Greeks came the Romans, and somewhere along the line, we ended up with this stone disappearing, and it was found in 1799 by Napoleon. So he said, what was he doing there? Well, after the Battle of the Nile, Nelson meant that stopped Napoleon getting back to France, and so he decided to do a bit of digging while he was there. And it was French troops under Napoleon, with Napoleon, who found the Rosetta Stone. 3 years later, it had come into the possession of the British and has been with the British Museum ever since in 1802. Later, it was to be a Frenchman who actually managed to translate or break the code, someone called Champollion. But, well, so who does this belong to? It's not as though the British Empire is flourishing now either. So whose is this? But I just mentioned this to say, look at all these empires. Is there one that is still with us now? So the message of the museum seems to be that none of these empires is permanent. This is also the message of the prophecy to Daniel. And this is also what we heard from C.S. Lewis, if you remember, during our session, during the course of his talk in St. Mary's Church, where this is what he said: there are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life to ours is as the life of a gnat. This is no more than what we read about in Scripture. 1 John 2:15, we read, "Do not love the world or anything in the world, for the world and its desires will pass away. But the man who does the will of God lives forever." The world and its desires pass away. I mean, this is what the museum tells us eloquently. The museum in some ways is a beautiful mausoleum itself, a place where old empires go to die, and it testifies to the brilliance, the ingenuity, the beauty, sometimes the pride, but ultimately the futility of what in its heyday was thought to be ultimate. It is not ultimate. This is what the museum tells us. And it makes us think of the message or the story of Abraham. It makes us who didn't settle down in his nice city of Ur, but had bigger hopes, who looked beyond. The prophecy of Daniel and the offspring. This is the tale. This is the Christian story, that there is more than just these empires. John Betjeman was a student of C.S. Lewis, and in a famous poem he asked this, and is it true? But is it true, this most tremendous tale of all? I'm far from being a perfect person. I'm riddled with all the same mess that all the rest of us are. Yeah, through and through. But I believe this tale is true. I believe in the Christian story, in the fulfillment of the promise given to Abraham. And if you're not sure about it, let me show you something. Let me show you some things that really are immortal. You ready for this? Here we are. It's us. It's people. There's a whole mixture of people there. These are all photographs from some of the British Museum tours that I've done in the past. And if you've not been on one of these tours, then I very much hope that perhaps in the course of 2001, you might come with me to the British Library or to Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, or come to Oxford and look around at Oxford's Christian heritage. Here's a summary of what we've talked about tonight. There you can see the Babylonian theme for the first 5, and then from 6 to 10, just asking about the bigger question about the message of the museum. This week we've seen we are, one more slide, there we are, that's the website that we've now got. This week has seen the opening of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford just yesterday. We've also had the announcement that the British Museum is going to open on the 27th. So with these changes, it seems this is an appropriate time to bring this series of webinars to a close. The series of 10 virtual tours that we've been doing together. Also during this period, as I say, your encouragement has allowed this website to come to fruition, and I'm going to be putting other things there from time to time. But I do hope, as I said before, that those who haven't I haven't met in person, that might have the chance of meeting you and perhaps doing tours with you or your friends, hopefully in 2021 in some of these places. The strapline of these tours is that if you are interested in the Bible, and if you like learning, you will love the tours. And I hope that that's been true for this series of webinars. Thank you.